Okay, how you doing? Kinesiology 223, Chapter 23, Children and Sports Psychology. This is a big beefy chapter, and also this is a big beefy presentation. I have like 16 slides we're going to try to get through here. So I'm going to be going kind of rapid fire. I'll put this up. I'm not going to speak too much to it. I'll let you pause me and kind of read through them because, like I said, I want to get through a lot of slides. All right, so if we jump into this, with some of the introductory points that they have, extracurricular activity, sports are one of the few areas where they can participate and have some meaningful outcomes and consequences for themselves and their peers. So it develops this camaraderie and it builds this cohesion between themselves and their friends on the team. Now, it can have some lifelong effects, right? I mean, I know people that I went to elementary school with that we played football together, and still have friends to this day that I played football with in college, and we still stay in contact with each other now, X amount of even decades later. So it helps you create and forge these tight bonds with people because you're kind of forging these relationships in a kind of a pressurized environment through athletics. So when you look at this, I like what the book is saying here is that there's these psychological and social values from participation. Sport parents, for example, list the development of personal and social values is highly important when asked why they have their children play sports. And I would say that to a certain degree, though, that some parents have their kids in sports for the wrong reasons, but that's another conversation. But the thing is, though, that becomes a conversation of his last statement down here is participation in organized sport is not always beneficial to the child. Sometimes parents put their children just in the wrong dang sport, and they should put them in a sport that they're actually good at or an activity they're good at. So I talk about this, the most important positive influence on young athletes. You have the balance that you have between young athletes being in a sport and the adults being involved in a sport is the challenge because adults will put the emphasis on winning and being better and doing all these great things, and they're very outcome oriented, and you want your children to be process oriented while they're in the sport itself. Otherwise, it just becomes, like we said in our previous presentation, it becomes a negative feedback cycle for those athletes because they end up never really living up to the end expectation, and so they end up having this anxiety that they can't perform. Now, there's a lot goes into youth sports. There's so many things in terms of all the different players, all the different coaches, the following leadership, following and understanding rules, the obligation to follow a practice schedule and a game schedule. There's many different things that go into this, and there's this entire ecosystem, if you will, of different individuals, different organizations. You have these subsystems and cultural factors that are within each. Club sports are different than house league baseball, and that's different than high school baseball. It's just different. Now, this heuristic sports model allows researchers and participants, practitioners to view sports as kind of a dynamic arrangement of factors. So it's not like a straight line athlete-sport relationship. It's more about the athlete being in the middle and all these different factors kind of in a model around it that help to mold and guide young athletes. It's rarely straight line, very complex, right? Now, the two main subsystems that are closest to youth athletes are the family and the actual team itself. The third is the organization that the student is or the athlete is involved in. And I mentioned that in terms of like house league is different than travel, then is different than your high school team. And there's certain complexity to that in terms of who plays on what teams, etc. And they go through and they do a pretty good job here of talking this through. But they talk about her soccer involvement is influenced by her own aspirations and the fact that she finds mastering the skills of the game and being with her friends to be a source of fun. So she's involved in a sport, right? And with that, if we kind of scroll this through and we read through it a little bit more, she is enjoying the game. She enjoys playing the game. And she, became involved. I'm right here, by the way, because her older brother participated. Now, her parents also encouraged her to play and express their beliefs in her. And so the family had its own little subsystem, its own ecosystem, if you will, regarding the game of soccer. Now, she's, had a knowledgeable and positively oriented coach who focused on helping improve her skills in the game. She was also motivated, in fact, by her best friend played on the team. So she had a lot of different things going for her. So she was finally able to play soccer in high school because of Title IX. And so one can just see the series of events that allowed this young lady to go from a subsystem or ecosystem that was her family with a very positive coach in a strong organization which then allows this to happen and be able to be involved further on. Also grew up seeing the success of the U.S. national women's team and also World Cup teams. So, she had these strong influences that were all around her, whether it was family, her coaching, or the influences of other players who are playing at a very high level. So why children participate? Most children participate for the fun of it, and that's why they're there. And coaches got to remember, they have to remember that. You can just jam drills down on athletes, but ultimately, you got to make it fun for your younger athletes, especially. They want to do something they're good at and they have an affinity for. They want to improve their skills. And this gets a little bit more specific when they realize they're good at something. They want to improve those skills, get a little exercise, get fit, and be kind of a sidebar. But the other part of this is be with friends. That's a biggie. Now, the boys, they note here, the boys are motivated by competition and the girls are more attracted to the social opportunities. But I will tell you, having coached youth sports, that even the boys, they like that social aspect and hanging out with their friends and, kind of jibing each other and giving each other grief when we're doing drills. So here's the reasons why they discontinue. Most discontinue at about 12 years old, and unfortunately, they go and sit in their basement and play video games. Oh my God, it's awful. Children, they list other things to do, like play video games, or they have a change of interest, and that's usually go play video games. And coaches and teammates are like the two most influential, just due to their proximity to the athlete, but also due to the influence they can have because of that proximity. Now, the girls list, lack of teamwork, this kind of team affiliation or lack of ability for discontinuing. And, I'll say this. So for every 10 children who begin a sport, 3 will drop out by the start of next season. That's a 30% attrition rate. And I think it's partially in terms of, athletes want to be able to play a sport that they're good at. And in some regard, if you create a culture where they're constantly battling it out to be the number one on the team at a particular position without giving little victories to your athletes, they're going to leave. You have to create a culture and foster a culture of competitiveness, but you also have to find a way to have little rewards and little victories for your athletes along the way. And it's just over here, they kind of go through and talk through some of the things I've bullet pointed over here to the left. And the big two that we talked about before were the coaches and the teammates. And the big thing you also have is, coaches and other youth sport leaders should be particularly sensitive to these issues when working with female athletes. And it's a question of how you can have more teamwork, how you can have greater team affiliation, and how you can have they talk about lack of ability for the athlete. Now I'll tell you, there's a limitation there in terms of genetic potential, but still, as a coach, you can find a way to find wins, and I say it all the time, for your athletes. So when we're talking about female athletes, you try to find ways to create these opportunities. And I talk about culture all the time, and part of culture in youth sports is finding ways to create opportunities for your athletes to be successful. Now, children discontinue participation. The younger ones drop out soon. And they drop out more often, they're saying here in the book. And one study showed that social identity was related to sport enjoyment, which predicted dropout. So we talked about social identity previously, and the correlation you have there is when you have athletes who have a poor social identity, they don't feel really involved with the group per se, they'll drop out of the sport. In a way, they feel almost ostracized anyways. Now they talk about fostering social ID on community sports, and teams can contribute to higher rates of enjoyment and lower dropout rates. I agree with that. And you can find ways to increase the social aspect of this. You can find ways to have your athletes create their own identities within the team environment, but also find a way to have your athletes become part of that cohesive unit and have a social identity with and amongst their peers on the team. So it need not be an all or none type thing. So when they talk about deeper motives here, they're talking about deeper motives, perceived competence, goal orientations, intrinsic motivation, and stress. So the reasons youth give for participation and dropping out are their surface level responses, not the deeper underlying motives. Some sports psychologists have thought, for example, they have low perceived competence. I just can't do it. I can't do the sport. Or at least they think they can't. And that's the perception part of it. They tend to focus on ego goals as opposed to process goals. They focus on outcome goals as opposed to process goals. They exhibit less determined intrinsic forms of motivation and experience considerable stress. So the stress itself is a manifestation of everything else in the process that's actually causing the stress, right? You have these different things that are happening where they just are not, they don't feel like they can actually do the sport. They don't feel like they fit in. They don't feel like they're part of the team. They don't feel like, or they're focusing on externally driven goals as opposed to intrinsically driven goals. And so as a result, it ends up being basically just a mix of things that are motives that cause somebody to drop out of athletics at a young age. So what they find is they conclude that the factor most consistently distinguishes youth sport participants from those who drop out is their level of perceived confidence. That is, children with low perceptions of their abilities to learn and perform sport skills do not participate. So as a coach, you kind of have to zero in on this and find ways, again, whether it's your athlete is starting or not, even if they're not a starter, you have to find a way to help them find wins. And as a coach now, you have to kind of create the culture to make that happen. So teach them how to evaluate their performances with their own standards of improvement rather than comparing competitive outcomes to others, meaning you won or lost, you're starting or you're not. And you talk about that achievement goal theory contends that people have different ways to define their ability, and they can adopt a self-referenced task or mastery goal orientation. And I would state that this is a really healthy way to work with an athlete who might not be a starter, who's still learning the game at a young age, as opposed to being very binary, you're starting or you're not. They can learn and they can evolve in the sport. But that's your job as a coach. You got to be able to do that. So children who have this low perception of their abilities, they'll tend to drop out. And this is what we just talked about in the previous slide, and there's a bit of a carryover from that, and I'm not going to belabor this because we just saw it, but it's that perceived competence. And sometimes you have to show your athletes the way. You have to show them that they actually have competency. It's just they have to learn the sport a little bit more, or how to apply a perfect skill in a particular environment. The book seems to lose sight of the original 4 items presented in this section, I have to admit. It looks as though they attempt to kind of tie it together with this passage. Children are more likely to participate, make decisions, youth athletes do more confident, etc. Finally, stress and burnout is just later in chapters. So it's very much when they're going through this passage, they're trying to show this perceived competence, goal orientations, intrinsic motivations, and stress. And they kind of lose sight, I think, in terms of like the stress part of it and how the stressors actually almost like push the athlete out of the sport. But it's a tie-in, right? The stress ties back to the level of perceived competence. It depends upon if they're what their goal orientation is, and it's also what their motivators are, if they're intrinsically motivated or extrinsically motivated. So in some regard, you're going to have to read through that passage probably 2 or 3 times, like I know I did, to be able to get what the book was talking about. Sport dropouts or samplers. So you'll have a participant who's involved in a particular sport and they want to get out of that sport, or they'll be a just general dropout and they'll withdraw from sports altogether. With youth sports participation, you have implications for your practice, right? The research shows why children participate or withdraw, and I would take a moment to pause me and read through these, but it's about having your athletes, the motivations that you have are intrinsic, not extrinsic. Winning is not the top of their list. Most young athletes have multiple reasons for participation, as we already seen. And when young athletes feel worthy and confident about an activity, that's that kind of self-worth and self-efficacy, they tend to continue to participate. And it also gets back to just their self perception of how they can do the sport. So I think of this internal model of motivation, how a person interacts with the situation. If we go back to chapter 4, you can kind of understand why children participate in a sport, and you can understand their motivation by structuring environments better to meet their needs. And I can't stress this enough when we start talking about this. You have to be able to provide an environment that's age appropriate and specific to that age to be able to have, sure, goal setting, and you want to win games, but there has to be a process goal as well. How are you doing? Are you getting better? Are you evaluating against yourself or others? Those are all things that are highly important. So youth sport participation, imitation, and practice. Main questions a coach should ask when a youth athlete discontinues. Here's your 4. Pause and read, please. And then we get into this. 5 action steps provided to the right are used to help increase youth sport participation and sustain involvement. Take a moment to read through those. And that's it. Made it in 15 minutes. On to the next one.